Wyoming Territory, 1872. The wind tore across the plain like a whip, dragging dust and the smell of old blood through the ramshackle mining camp called Granger's Hollow. The saloon door banged against the wall, and the laughter of men inside spilled out into the dusty street. Somewhere behind that din, a girl stood on a wooden crate with a sack tied over her head and her wrists bound in rawhide. She was just 19. Someone muttered about her hips, good for breeding. Another man spat into the dirt. Coins clinked. Boots shuffled. The auction was quiet, but it wasn't silent. Evil never is. Inside the sack, Lena Mae Dalton tried not to breathe too deeply. The burlap reeked of mold and tobacco. Her heart thudded so loudly in her chest she feared they could hear it. She clenched her jaw and told herself not to cry, not in front of them. Sold, someone said. Not shouted. Not barked. Just spoken. Flat as a nailhead. Hands grabbed her, yanked her down. The crate scraped against the ground. She stumbled, nearly falling, but someone caught her elbow and shoved her toward a wagon. The sack was still on her head. She was lifted into a buckboard like a sack of flour. The ride out of town began with no words. The driver didn't speak. Neither did the girl. She counted the turns by feel, guessed direction by wind. The horses' hooves thudded like war drums across the prairie. When the sack was finally pulled off her head, the sun had gone down and she was standing in front of a decrepit ranch house, its porch slumping like an old man's spine. The man who'd bought her stood in the doorway, framed by a dim lantern glow. He was gaunt, with a smoker's cough and a face like dry bark. His name was Elias Graft. "This is her?" he asked. "She's whole." "That's all I know," said the driver, already turning back toward town. Graft looked her up and down with no more interest than a man buying rope. He motioned with his chin. Inside. Lena stepped forward on shaking legs. Her dress stuck to her back with sweat and fear. The floor creaked beneath her boots. Inside, the air was stale. She saw a stove, an old Bible on a shelf, and a row of rifles by the door. No pictures. No warmth. "You'll cook at sunrise. Clean at dusk. Don't touch what ain't yours. Don't talk unless you're asked." His voice scratched like gravel. She nodded. He pointed to a narrow staircase. "Upstairs. Last room. Door locks from outside." She obeyed. That night, as the key turned behind her, she stared at the cracked ceiling and thought about the sound her mother made when she coughed blood. She thought about the river where she used to catch frogs as a child. She thought about how far she'd fallen. And she realized she didn't even have her own name anymore. To them, she was just the girl they sold. The days blurred. Morning came with a shouted order, night came with a locked door. She made biscuits. She scrubbed floors. She washed blood from the cuffs of Graft's shirts without asking why it was there. He never touched her, but he watched. That was somehow worse. She learned the creaks in the floor, the call of the hawks overhead, the path the sun took across the kitchen wall. She found small ways to stay sane. She spoke to a mouse that lived behind the stove. Named it Clover. It listened better than most men ever had. One day, she tried to run. Graft had gone to town for feed. She pried at the back window with a chipped spoon until the frame cracked. She pulled herself out, tore her dress on a nail, and sprinted barefoot across the brittle grass. She made it to the tree line before the rifle cracked. The bullet hit the dirt 2 feet from her heel. He was behind her already, on horseback. He circled her slow, like a buzzard. Didn't say a word. Just pulled her back onto the saddle like a sack of potatoes. That night, her door wasn't just locked. It was barred. He didn't hit her again. Not with his hands. But the silence became a weight. The house turned colder. The air tighter. She spoke to Clover more often. Drew things in the dust under her bed, birds, rivers, open gates. Then came the storm. The sky turned black with no warning. Graft barked orders, saddled his horse, and rode out to gather scattered cattle. Thunder rolled in behind him. Lightning cracked the sky into pieces. The house shook under the weight of the wind. And for the first time, he left without locking her door. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the shawl from the peg, stuffed bread into her apron, and bolted. The back window still hung loose. She slipped through it, hit the ground running. The wind screamed like a banshee. Rain whipped her face raw. She crossed the fence line, sprinted down the ravine, and kept running until her legs buckled. Somewhere near the river, she collapsed. The ground was wet and cold. Her breath came in gasps. A branch had slashed her calf, she didn't care. She tried to crawl, but her arms trembled. Her vision blurred. Then she heard it. Hoofbeats. A rider. She turned her face, heart pounding. She expected Graft. Or worse, one of his hands. But what emerged from the trees wasn't rage or cruelty. It was silence. A lone figure on horseback, wrapped in a duster slick with rain. A broad-brimmed hat cast his face in shadow. The horse came closer, cautious. The man dismounted, moving like a whisper. He crouched beside her, eyes scanning her face, then the wound on her leg. He didn't speak. Just lifted her gently, like she was made of something fragile. Carried her beneath a cliffside overhang where the rain couldn't reach. Started a fire with practiced ease. Wrapped her leg in cloth. Poured warm water between her lips. Still, not a word. She opened her eyes at dawn, throat raw, skin fevered. "You," she croaked. "Who are you?" The man didn't answer. He just looked at her with those pale gray eyes. And for the first time in what felt like forever, Lena wasn't afraid. She didn't know who he was. Or where he'd come from. But she knew one thing with the clarity of a sunrise. He wasn't Graft. And that was enough for now. The morning sun filtered through the trees, casting dappled shadows over the girl's fevered face. Lena stirred against the soft bed of pine needles, blinking up at the sliver of blue sky above. The ache in her leg returned first, then the memory, the storm, the flight, the rider cloaked in silence. He was still there. Seated by the fire, sharpening a knife with quiet, deliberate strokes. His hat shaded most of his face, but she could see the edge of his jaw, rough with stubble, unmoving. A man carved from stone and smoke. Where am I?" she asked, voice dry as burlap. The man didn't speak. He looked over, then reached into his satchel and handed her a tin cup of warm broth. She sipped gratefully, though her hands trembled. The scent was unfamiliar, gamey, wild herbs, but it filled her with something like life. She eyed him over the rim of the cup. He wore no badge. No brand. No name stitched into his coat. Just a revolver on his hip and eyes like cold ash. "You got a name?" she tried. Still, silence. He turned back to the fire, slid the knife into its sheath, then stood and began tending to his horse, rubbing it down, checking the hooves. Everything he did was precise. Quiet. Practiced. She watched him move, and the questions she might have asked tangled in her throat. Maybe he didn't want her to know his name. Maybe it had been taken from him like hers had. Later that day, he built a small travois out of pine and rope. Lifted her onto it without strain. She tried not to wince when the wound throbbed. He led the horse slow, keeping to the trees, always listening. Always watching. Once, he paused suddenly and motioned her to stillness. Moments later, two riders thundered down the far ridge. She recognized Graft's stallion among them. Her breath stopped. But the stranger waited. Didn't panic. Just pressed a finger to his lips, and in that moment, she realized something strange. He wasn't afraid. Not of Graft. Not of guns. Not even of the wilderness. When the riders vanished, he resumed without a word. By dusk, he had found an old trapper's cabin tucked into the valley. The door creaked on rusted hinges. Dust swirled in sunbeams. The place smelled of cedar, ash, and age. But it had a bed. A stove. Walls that kept wind out. He laid her on the straw mattress and built another fire. Then he disappeared into the night. She didn't sleep at first, thinking he'd left her. But he returned hours later with jerky, roots, wild berries, and a rabbit, freshly skinned. He cooked without flair but with care, and when she ate, she found herself crying. Not because of the pain. But because no one had fed her like that in years. The next morning, she could put weight on the leg, just barely. He watched her limp across the floor without offering help. Not out of cruelty, but something else. He was letting her reclaim herself. One slow step at a time. "Why are you helping me?" she asked, breaking the quiet. He didn't answer. But something passed between them in that silence. A flicker of understanding. He wasn't there to own her. Or save her like some hero from a dime novel. He was simply present. And that made her trust him more than any promise ever could. Still, questions lingered. Who was he? Why so quiet? What drove a man into the hills with nothing but a horse, a gun, and a stare that made men shrink? She found part of an answer that evening. He'd stepped outside to chop wood, and in the fading light, she noticed the way he moved. One arm favored. A stiffness in the shoulder. He winced, barely, but she saw it. Later, after he fell asleep near the fire, she crept closer and lifted the edge of his coat. There, along his ribs, were old scars. Bullet wounds. Some fresh. Some ancient. And across his back, a brand. Faint, but unmistakable. A Confederate D burned into his skin. Deserter. Lena stared, her breath catching. Whatever he had been, he'd walked away from it. Paid dearly for it. And now he lived in the silence between the past and whatever future he no longer believed in. The next morning, she didn't ask anything more. Instead, she helped him wash the pots. Cleaned the rifle. Sat beside him while he worked on repairing a bridle. Small things. But they mattered. She found her voice again. Told him about her mother, who died coughing in their sod house while the doctor charged more than they had. Told him about the debt that came after, and how Graft offered to relieve the burden by taking her. You sell a mule, you haggle, she said, laughing bitterly. They didn't even bother with that. Still, he said nothing. But when she looked away, his jaw tightened. She wasn't sure when it happened, exactly. Maybe it was the way he handed her his coat without a word when she shivered. Or how he stood between her and the open doorway, every time. But she began to feel safe. And that terrified her. Because safety meant hope. And hope was dangerous. Late one night, as wind scraped against the shutters, she asked the question she'd been holding back for days. Are you going to leave? He was silent. Then finally, a whisper. Rough. Low. Not yet. 2 words. That was all. But she clung to them like rope in a flood. The days passed in slow rhythm. They repaired the cabin together. She laughed for the first time in months when he fumbled a hammer and muttered under his breath. He even smiled, just once, quick and crooked, but real. Like something long buried had stirred awake. They didn't speak of the outside world. Not until the rider came. It was the sound first. Distant hooves. A crow rising from the tree lean. The quiet man stood immediately, eyes narrowing. He took the rifle from the wall and stepped outside. She followed, heart hammering. A single rider approached. Dusty. Armed. His coat bore Graf's brand, an iron stitch to the left sleeve. The man didn't slow until he saw the quiet stranger in the path. He sneered. You the one hidin' the girl? Silence. She's Graf's property. Ain't wise to meddle. Still nothing. The rider spat. Look, cowboy, this ain't your fight. She's a piece of meat, not your damn mission. Let her go and you won't. The stranger moved. Faster than thought. A shot cracked. The rider tumbled from his horse, screaming, his shoulder shredded. The man didn't shoot to kill, just to stop. He stepped forward, gun raised, eyes empty of threat but full of certainty. Tell Graf, he said, voice a rasp of smoke, she ain't his. The rider scrambled away, clutching his arm. Blood spattered the grass. He mounted with difficulty and galloped off without looking back. Lena stood behind the man, chest tight. He hadn't asked her what she wanted. He just acted. Like he knew she didn't belong in chains anymore. She looked at him then, not the silence, not the mystery, but him. And for the first time, she didn't feel like the girl who'd been sold. She felt like someone worth fighting for. The wind picked up. And somewhere in the distance, the storm was gathering again. The night before the storm, the prairie went still, too still. Not even the coyotes howled. Smoke curled from the chimney of the trapper's cabin, a fragile signal in the vast emptiness, drawing eyes that shouldn't have found it. Lena lay awake, staring at the rafters above her. The stranger sat near the hearth, cleaning his rifle with steady hands, but something in his posture had changed. He was listening too hard. Waiting. She felt it in her bones. They both knew Graf wouldn't stop. The man had power in the territory, men who rode not for coin, but fear. And now, with one of them shot and bleeding, he'd come himself. Lena's breath trembled. She had fled before. Survived on scraps and silence. But this would be different. She rose, moved to the table. Teach me, she said. The quiet man looked up. She gestured toward the revolver on the table. Her hands shook. If he comes, I won't be a victim again. His stare held hers for a long time. Then, with slow care, he picked up the weapon and set it in front of her. He showed her how to load it, how to cock it, how to aim for center mass and not flinch. She practiced in the yard at dawn, shooting at a tin cup nailed to a fence post until her fingers blistered and the bruises on her palms bloomed dark. She wasn't a crack shot. But she'd hit what mattered. On the second night, the rider returned, alone this time. A messenger. Young. Nervous. He tossed a blood-stained rag at their feet, torn from the coat of the man the stranger had shot. He says you got 3 days, the rider croaked. 3 days to give her back or he burns the land you hide on. The stranger didn't move. Lena did. She picked up the rag and flung it into the fire. Tell him I'm not his anymore. The boy paled, turned, and galloped into the dusk. By the third morning, the clouds rolled low and dark. Thunder mumbled beyond the ridges. The man stood outside sharpening his knife, and Lena stood beside him, hands clenched. I could still run, she said. He wants me, not you. If I go, maybe he'll leave. The stranger didn't let her finish. He reached out and, for the first time, touched her hand. Not to silence her, but to steady her. No, he said. That single word held more weight than a sermon. That night, they made ready. He cut brush to cover the back trail. Dug trenches near the rise and buried rifles wrapped in oilcloth. She gathered water, packed jerky, loaded every round they had. They worked without speaking. A kind of wordless pact sealed in sweat and purpose. Just before midnight, lightning forked across the sky. And with it came the riders. 5. No, 7. They didn't approach quietly. Graft wanted to be heard. Wanted the ground to tremble. His men rode in a V formation, guns drawn, torches in hand. They meant to burn the cabin down with her inside. But the stranger had been waiting. From the trees, the first shot rang out, dropping the lead rider before his torch hit the ground. Chaos erupted. Horses reared. Gunfire cracked. Shadows danced with firelight as men scattered. Graft's voice rose above the roar. "Bring me the girl. The man dies slow." Lena crouched behind the woodpile, heart thudding, revolver tight in her grip. Her hands shook, but her aim was steady when a rider burst from the trees. She fired once, missed. Fired again, caught his arm. He dropped his rifle, screaming. She didn't wait to see if he got back up. The quiet man moved through the firelight like smoke, unseen, lethal. 2 more fell beneath his shots. A third tried to flank him with a blade, but Lena shouted a warning, and the cowboy spun, slamming the attacker to the dirt with the butt of his gun. Blood soaked the prairie. Then Graft emerged. He rode a black gelding, scarred and mean, his long coat billowing like a vulture's wings. His eyes found Lena in the chaos, and he smiled. "You think this ends with bullets?" he called. "You think he's the first man to kill for you? He'll be dead by dawn, and you'll be back where you belong." She raised the revolver. He laughed. But then, the quiet man stepped between them. Graft's smile faltered. The 2 men stared across the field, thunder cracking above. Graft drew first, but the stranger didn't flinch. He fired once, clean. Graft's horse reared, and the man toppled backwards, blood blooming from his chest. Silence. The storm swallowed the last echoes of gunfire. Smoke drifted across the torn grass. One by one, Graft's men either fled or dropped their weapons. No one spoke. The stranger stood tall, shoulders heaving. Lena lowered her gun. It was over. When morning broke, the field was quiet again. Birds returned to the trees. The prairie smelled of rain and gunpowder. She walked to the stranger's side, limbs heavy with exhaustion. "You should go," he said, voice rough. She blinked. "What?" He didn't meet her eyes. "You've got a life to live. Ain't no place for you in the shadows I walk in. But I don't want. You don't belong to anyone now. Not me. Not him. You're free." The words hit harder than any wound. Freedom was what she'd dreamed of, what she'd bled for, but now it tasted like loss. He turned to leave, horse saddled, gear packed. Already fading back into the hills. Just another ghost in the wild. She stepped forward. "Wait." He stopped. "Tell me your name." The wind picked up, stirring the grass. He looked over his shoulder. "Calder," he said softly. Then he rode. No promises. No goodbyes. Just the name of a man who gave her back her own. She stood on that blood-streaked prairie long after the dust settled. Watching the trail. Remembering his silence. His steadiness. The way he'd stood between her and the worst of the world. Not as a savior. But as a reminder that even broken men can choose to protect. Weeks later, she'd find a town, a job, a room with real walls. But at night, when the wind howled against the eaves, she'd still hear that single word whispered in the dark. Calder. She didn't know where he was. But she knew he was out there. And that was enough.